Castle and the Centers for Independent Living present this board management training on the history of independent living, presented by Paula L. McElwee of McElwee and Associates. Paula works with the Independent Living Research Utilization.
Anyway, the Independent Living Act movement actually was begun in the late 60s and early 70s, and it happened in different places around the country at the same time. The one we hear about the most was Ed Roberts at Berkeley in the 60s. Now, if you lived during the 60s, I know some of you are too young to know this, but if you lived during the 60s, you know Berkeley in the 60s kind of leads to a certain viewpoint about political activity, because there was a lot of political activity going on, not just in Berkeley, other places too. So the fact that this movement emerged during the 60s is really not that unusual. There was a lot of activity around rights and around different kinds of services and the different kinds of access issues going on across the country. So the Civil Rights Act was passed when? In 1964, right? 65. I always get mixed up on that one. 64, right? Yeah, Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. We were talking about access to what? Schools, buses, all kinds of things. Does that sound familiar at all? Anyway, so suddenly we began to see things differently. We began to see things we had kind of taken for granted as oh, you mean I have the right to that? I talked to a man who was one of the rolling quads with Ed Roberts on the Berkeley campus. He lives in the Bay Area, and he came in and did his training for us, a local training for us. And he said, you know, I grew up in a fairly well-to-do family. He used a wheelchair from the time he was, 7 or 8, so he grew up in the school system. He said our school was built in such a way that the first floor had kindergarten, first and second grade, and third grade. And then the upper grades were on the upper floor. That's the way it was built. And he said, they built me a ramp to get me up into this first floor. And I was small enough that, toileting was a big issue in grade school because everybody could help me out because, we didn't have to worry about accessibility because it was little kids. But when it came time to graduate to the 4th grade, he said we never even thought that we might ask that they move the 4th grade to the first floor. Never occurred to us. He said it didn't even cross our minds. Now, isn't that a bizarre thought today? But he said, you've got a picture. It was a time when we were just, we didn't want to put anybody out. And wasn't it nice of them to carry me up the stairs every day, And he said it didn't make any sense, but we weren't thinking in terms of rights. And that it was a different time. By the time the 60s came along, not just the civil rights movement, but also the women's movement, other movements around the country were beginning to have us think differently. IL responds to the belief that people with disabilities should be able to exert control over their own lives and make their own decisions about what affects people. And the centers became available through funding in the 70s and 80s through the Rehab Act. Some of the centers here in Kansas, we wrote our grant in 78 and we were first funded in 79 at Link. Came about very early in this process and have continued that funding both through direct Part C grants and the Part B grants that some of you get. Those funds became available, but there were centers before that, and that's the thing that we sometimes forget. We sometimes forget that before those first 10 states got funding from the Rehab Act, there were centers in a number of states, California, Texas, Ohio, Colorado for some, that were already beginning to formulate what a center ought to look like, and what should a center do, and how should it develop, and how could it be a part of the growth out of the community of people with disabilities in that given community. Whoops, wrong way, sorry. So as we said, the other social change movements contributed greatly to what happened then in the independent living movement. Consumerism, if you don't know what that is, that's Ralph Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed. See, I'm dating myself again. It was the right as a consumer to expect safety and quality in a product that you buy. Before that, there were no consumer service personnel at the local store. You didn't get to return stuff if it didn't work. We forget all this, you know, but it was also a social change movement that was going on. The demedicalization, deinstitutionalization movement in the developmental disabilities world was a part of this. We were saying people should be able to live in the community, not live out in that institution out at the edge of town, but should instead be a part of their communities. And that was part of what was going on and beginning to go on. That mostly came from parents of people with developmental disabilities, although in the mental health world, it was coming also from people who had mental health concerns. And they were able to begin to see things differently. Now, independent living is not a medical model. Sometimes we get ourselves all trapped up in this, but a few brief thoughts about what that means. So in a medical model, the individual with a disability is what? A patient or a client with medical or other professionals making the decision. The medical field has gotten a little better about at least some pieces around this, but you still see that doctors feel like they have, they have the answer, whether you know it or not. And sometimes you have to talk back to your doctor. Now we will. Back then we didn't. We just didn't talk back to the doctor. So we look at it differently. We use the term consumer. I hear a lot of people say, "Oh, I want to change the term to whatever, something else." Language is important. We chose consumer intentionally because remember that consumer movement that was going on, right? So there was a kind of situation where we said, okay, this is a person who actually has the right to receive from us a certain service or product with all the rights that go along with having, being in charge of that purchase or that type of service. So that was the thought behind that. In the medical profession, then it's the doctor or the clinician, whoever it is, that runs things, controls the plan, sets the course, and in independent living, it's the consumer who does that. It's a very different viewpoint when we look at it. In desired outcomes, the medical model is for maximum self-care, gainful employment, a cure. In independent living, we approach it from a different direction. We still may end up with maximum self-care, gainful employment, but we approach it from the direction of how can the person have control and make those day-to-day decisions around living and have a good quality of life while they do it in a community-based environment. And the reality is that if you go to some of you might have this experience, if you go to a physical therapist after an injury, they're going to teach you how to put on your socks and how to do whatever. And you might want to hire an attendant to do that because it takes too dang long and you want to get to work in the morning on time, right? So there's the difference between the medical model, which wants you to do these pieces according to a physical therapist plan, and the model of, hey, I'm in charge of my life and I decide what's worth it to spend my time on. And I may rearrange my time in a way that I have assistants doing some of those things that are just tedious for me because I want to use my energy for something else. Does that make sense? So that's part of the difference between the independent living and the medical model. Now we're going to look at a short video. This is called Emergence of Independent Living, and it's one of those 4 videos that I was talking about just a moment ago. So let's take a quick second and look at that.